Hi, folks, and thanks for joining us here at Some Future for episode 17 of our podcast. We are your hosts, Jack and Chris.
Hey!
Guys, today our discussion is out of this world, figuratively and literally. Whoa, mind blown, right?
Whoa.
On Present Futures, we will be discussing the future of cities and mega research centers. On PaleoFutures, we will be discussing the futurist Alvin Toffler. And on FizBiz, we will be discussing investing in space. and as always, we will have a prominent futurist as our guest. We hope that you enjoy our show, and please visit our website and blog where we post our supporting materials at www.somefuture.org. Follow us on our Twitter handle @SomeFuture, or visit us on our Facebook page. We always welcome your engagement with questions, concerns, or ideas of things you would like to hear about on our podcast by emailing us at somefuturepodcast@gmail.com or by engaging with us on social media. Now let's see what the future has in store for us in Some Future.
That's Some Future. Okay, so cool. So for my Present Futures, I wanted to take a look at, it's not just, I saw a series of futuristic stories on the future of cities, and I thought this would be an interesting aside to kind of take a look at the different ways that people are looking at cities. The first one I actually take a look at was someone who's being sort of a contrarian in this futuristic view. It's by this woman named Grace Lisa Scott. I got this from inverse.com, and she's talking about, the title is Future Cities Built for People and Not Cars Could Look Like This. So essentially what this person was surmising is that, well, it's actually a look at somebody else who surmised this, right? So there's a gentleman by the name of David Galbraith. He's a former architect who trained with Norman Foster. He's an entrepreneur, and now he's just writing blog accounts on his Medium account, and he's talking about the future of cities. And what he says is, I think, actually fairly appropriate now, and I'll get to that in just a little bit. But essentially, what he said is that, the urban planning that we've been doing for the past 70, 80 years has been urban planning that's been very much planned around grid systems, right? So, if you were to take a bird's eye view of Barcelona, London, Rome, San Francisco, Phoenix, Toronto, you will see regimented squares, rectangles, very specific, easily identifiable nodes and systems that were really built initially for people, but also for vehicles. And matter of fact, you see this very prominently in the United States. Matter of fact, there's a line where the line, or excuse me, the cities that were built below this line in the United States were typically the newer cities, like a Houston or Phoenix, Arizona. And so you could see just by the build of these cities that these cities were specifically for cars, whereas places like New York City, Boston, they were more built for pedestrian travel and or buggies, because that's what was happening in between, right? So what David Galbraith believes is that the future of cities will be way more natural, right? So there'll be more. They'll look more like what you'd see in medieval cities. So we're sort of going back to the future, where we're going to be seeing less of this mechanical, very regimented designed skyscrapers and everything having its neat little place, and we're going to see more of these natural sort of scapes, if you will, become the blueprints for society. I think that's particularly helpful to look at. And one thing that's actually very contrarian to a lot of the views that we see when we imagine, or at least when I see a lot of futuristic cityscapes that are in movies, or Star Wars, like Coruscant is this city of, it's a whole planet that's a city, right? And you see it's very much built like a New York City or a Tokyo or a Mexico City on steroids. Lots of buildings, lots of stuff happening all at the same time. You don't really see a lot of green spaces. So this is actually really important, I think, when we also look at a New York Times article that I saw. And the New York Times article, it says the suburb of the future almost here, right? So really, this is more millennial stuff. You and I are millennials, and of course, millennials are shaking the foundation of what it means to be an American, and so essentially, it's saying that millennials do not want the gigantic yards and the McMansions that their family had, right? They don't mind kind of tighter quarters. They don't mind things that are in walking distance, small parks. Maybe not necessarily having to have vehicles to transport you everywhere. Sustainable, sustainable houses, lots and houses that are a little bit smaller. More flexible landscapes and stuff. And then, of course, there are definite technologies that will be embedded here as well. So there's the paths of drones where you'll have great drone delivery systems and knowing and identifying spaces where these things can come and park themselves. And speaking of parking, autonomous cars are going to start infiltrating these suburbs and will maybe take up a lane in your particular area. And then even smarter landscapes, right? So not only having well-designed sidewalks that are pedestrian and bike friendly, less fenced off backyards and more open common areas like recreational spaces or vegetable gardens, or even well-designed forest and vernal ponds and wetlands. But also the fact that you need more of this, right? And this is actually really appropriate. So, as you know, we just had a hurricane. Matter of fact, we're having a slew of hurricanes that have hit the United States and places in the Caribbean. This has been a terrible thing for a lot of the folks in these damaged areas. Shout out to Houston. I went to University of Houston. I lived there for a long time, and my heart goes with everybody who's rebuilding there. But one thing that's really important here when we talk about the future of cities is that it's vital that we have more green spaces. One issue that Houston had when it was hit by Hurricane Harvey was the fact that it was built for vehicles. So there's a lot of concrete in Houston. It's a very flat area. It's built on a swamp. And as that rain hit the concrete, they had nowhere to go, and it stayed there. And one lesson is that for the future cities of tomorrow, it might be good to have good green space, because as more climate changes, or even just periodic heavy rainfall happens, that rain is going to go ahead and soak up into the ground and the land versus just finding itself on top of the concrete. So I know we had a couple other videos and things in terms of the future of cities. What's your take on the future of cities, Jack?
Well, so Chris, you know that so I'm actually pretty involved in the in what they call the Smart City Initiative for my city in Atlanta, but I've also connected with a lot of other people who are in charge of smart city initiatives in Orlando and Boston and New York. And it's really fascinating that this is really a growing field, and it's because it's important. Because 70% of our population is very soon going to be living in cities, and that's not United States population; that's world population. There's a point where cities are going to be where we live and what we do. So I see all these initiatives about smart technologies, renewable technologies, renewable energies that are going to power these cities. It's really cool stuff. Like there's an initiative to have each building generate its own, not only its own power through solar panels or through some sort of wind turbines, but also to generate its own water, because there is a technology out there that can take the water out of the air, and you could generate all the water that your house uses by having this technology incorporated into your house. There's really cool things as far as transportation. You mentioned transportation. I think that if you look at some cities that are being changed or crafted, there are some cities that are now being crafted without, like you said, without any sort of vehicular traffic at all. That they're just walkable cities or bikeable cities, or public transportation cities as far as subways or whatnot. I think that's going to be the new trend. You know me, I love flying vehicles. I know that we talk about autonomous vehicles, but I think that Uber has this initiative that they're trying to roll out in New York of flying vehicles, flying taxis. I think my city of Atlanta, it would be perfect for it, because there's so many open roads and there's so much land that it'd be very easy to turn some of these roads just into landing spaces for these vehicles. I think of one good initiative. So several cities are launching their own initiatives to try to combat this and reduce traffic and turn highways into waterways or other forms of public space. If you look at Singapore, so Singapore actually charges people $140,000 to own a Toyota Corolla, and you don't actually even own it; you actually lease it for 10 years. So there are cities that are actually making it difficult for people to own a car, so that people will use public transit and get rid of that stigma that exists of only the poor people use public transit or things like that. Because Atlanta is a good example of that. So Atlanta in the 1970s and 60s had an opportunity to expand its public transit system, and the people in the suburbs said, "Heck no, no way! That's going to bring all those bad elements from the city into our suburbs." So they didn't actually expand the public transit system. So of course, Atlanta has a horrible public transit system. They have a subway that goes up and down and one that goes left and right. Like that's really the two lines that they have. They have like two or three, but that's it. And that's something that is not sustainable for a future of a city. And cities like Atlanta are now figuring out, well, what do we do? How do we combat that? If I can recommend anything to our listeners, and is to research the smart city initiatives that are occurring in your city and become a part of it. I mean, obviously, if you're listening to this podcast, you have at least a love of technology. These people really need new ideas and new and involvement from the community to get these movements moving. And I think that there's just a lot of opportunities for that.
That's fantastic. I think it's one to be involved, right? Like, so actually using your futures knowledge to make an impact in your community. I think that's really great. One thing also is really important, I think, is to look at examples. One is the Songdo International Business District in Korea. So this was built from scratch from reclaimed land from Incheon, South Korea's waterfront, and they created a smart city, right? 106 buildings, 22 million square feet of LEED space, green building certification. Everything is interconnected. They have tubes that get rid of all the trash in the city, telepresence, where they have a joint venture by Cisco and developers of the city, where it allows Songdo residents to sit in front of customized television screens and chat with English tutors in Hawaii and take fitness classes from everywhere. So it's all integrated. Everything's interconnected. A true city of tomorrow, right? Now, of course, that's they've gone through. This is a huge investment. It's $35 billion. They're still sort of running through the kinks, but I think it's good and it's interesting to look at an example like Songdo as a way, through getting your city to kind of transform into a smart city. Songdo still has lots of green spaces, as we were talking about, lots of great breath of fresh air. Of course, a whole host of familiar transit options, buses, subways, nice thoroughfares, and even actually a lot of bicycling. So, I think it's really good to take a hard look at not only what's happening inside of your city, but take a look at what's sort of working, across the world. Cities are super important part of the future of the world. I think we've gone from 14% of people living in cities around the turn of the century. We're at 54 currently percent of the human population is in cities. We'll be up to 70% come, I think, 2050. So we're going to be pretty much a city run society. And I think it's best for us to optimize that living as best as we can.
Okay, Chris. So for my present futures, I wanted to bring up something that could probably be featured on one of those, history shows about mega whatevers, whatever. So I want to bring up mega or giant research centers as my topic for today. Now, it's a topic that we don't really bring up enough on this show. And I think that that's a shame because all of these technologies have to come from somewhere. And that is research centers and universities are building these giant centers for many different reasons. And these centers are not only huge in size, but they employ thousands of people and cost billions of dollars to build and to keep running.
I didn't even know about these. Yeah, I didn't even know.
You've heard of some of them, so this is pretty cool.
Okay.
So it's just as the pace of technology just enables us to achieve these like greater and greater goals. We as a society have to work together to achieve these goals of cleaner technologies, new innovations in material making, new innovations in medicine, and new ways of understanding our universe, amongst many other reasons why we need to create these types of centers. Therefore, I wanted to briefly touch on several research centers that have been making the news lately. Because gone are the days of, the one-man shops like Galileo, Sir Isaac Newton, or Einstein. And here to stay is the information age, which involves collaboration on a global scale. And I wanted to bring these up to show that science is not only becoming more prevalent due to the ever-increasing rates of return, but that it's also getting larger, involving these swaths of people from many different governments and countries from all over the world. So I wanted to start with one that I'm sure you've heard of. It's CERN, which is a project that 22 countries are working on, and which houses things like the Large Hadron Collider, which is 17 miles of tunnels moving particles faster than anything else on Earth, looking for particles never before theorized, attempting to solve supersymmetry and trying to find evidence of like parallel universes. And I mean, it's a really cool consortium of these different countries and scientists working together to find out all of these different answers for what the universe, the questions that the universe is throwing out there at them. That's one that's really cool. One that you probably have not heard of, which is actually in our own backyard, is, have you heard of Tevatron?
Yes.
Yeah, so that's the world's second largest hadron collider, which is located just outside of Chicago and was in operation from 1971 to 2011, and which actually verified CERN's results when they found the Higgs boson. And of course, that's when they found a new particle, something that they hadn't discovered before, and they keep finding new particles, which is pretty cool. I'm going to bring up another one. So there's one called Super Kamiokande, which is a giant neutrino detector where thousands of cylinders of water wait for the annihilation of interacting neutrinos, and it actually won the Nobel Prize in 2015 for the discovery that neutrinos have mass, which people who are not as crazy sciencey as some others, that actually helps us to understand the universe. There's things like the National Radio Astronomy, which is a very large array, which was built in the 1980s. It's which hunted for alien radio signals and discovered things in our own solar system like frozen water and Mercury. It's been featured in a bunch of different movies. It has 27 telescopes, which are actually on, what people don't realize is it's actually on a track so that they can be moved. They can be actually as close as within 2,000 square feet. All 27 of them can be within that square area, or they can be 13 miles apart. So it's a pretty neat thing. And like I said, I'm just going to name a bunch of these just to get people thinking about what these are, looking them up and seeing what they're doing. And you can see that a lot of these discoveries that we talk about on our show come from these centers. So there's Arecibo, which is, you may not have heard of that, but you've definitely seen it. It's actually where James Bond's GoldenEye was shot. It's the largest single aperture radio telescope in the world, and it's about 1,000 feet high and located in the forests of Puerto Rico. It listens for pulsars, galaxies, and of course, like a lot of these big telescopes, it's listening for aliens. So we can steal their ideas. And then, of course, there's China, which has started building a 1,650-foot telescope, so 650 more feet than Arecibo. It's in the hills of Guizhou, where 10,000 people have actually been relocated, and I'm sure you've heard about that, to give the radio dish a quiet zone. And it was purposely built, I think, by the Chinese also to dwarf Arecibo to if they do find smart aliens, they can steal their technology faster than we can. So you've got Atacama Large Millimeter Array, which was actually finished in 2013, and it includes 66 large telescopes, which is on a mountain in Chile, which allows it to be one of the most precise radio astronomy observatories in the world. It's yielded amazing glimpses into our universe past and planets very far away. It's a really cool observatory. We've gotten a lot of our space, I guess, new age ideas from, where we found out things in the past couple of years. One that I thought was really cool was there's this thing called the National Ignition Facility. I don't know if you've ever heard of that one, but that's actually in the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory in California, which is it's a 10-story chamber where 192 different lasers focus in on particles of hydrogen, where they attempt to compress them until a fusion reaction occurs. And 500 trillion watts of energy, are aimed toward that small target in the midst of it all, with the hope that someday they could get more energy back out than what they put into it, which would be obviously the holy grail of fusion if we could figure out fusion. There's TNA2, which people have heard of, but they don't know that that's the name of it. That's the most powerful supercomputer in the world, where there's a total of 16,000 nodes in the supercomputer, which are used to crunch numbers for the Chinese government and, of course, aid in national security, blocking people from the internet, things like that. I'm going to bring up a couple more, and that's the Stanford Underground Research Facility. This is what kind of gave me the idea to do this Present Futures. So that's actually based in North Dakota, and a lot of people don't know that. It's a facility that sits in the largest and deepest gold mine in North America. And actually, that gold mine produced more gold than any other mine in the world, which is pretty interesting. It actually houses more than 1,000 scientists, and currently there are many projects going on, including a project that is being constructed 4,800 feet underground, which will require 800,000 tons of rock to be removed, which is equal to about 8 aircraft carriers, and it's going to employ over 2,000 people, that whole construction project. It's an underground research facility that researches dark matter, which is pretty neat, antimatter, and neutrinos. So there's one more that is really cool that I wanted to bring up, and this is by far not an extensive list. These things are all giant facilities employing thousands of people or hundreds of people, and this is Kolos Base in Norway. It's still under construction, but when it's completed, it will be the world's largest data center, which has a fjord, which is like a river in the mountains, running through it to keep it cold, and it will actually generate 1,000 milliwatts of energy when it's fully operational. And just to give you a size of all of this, it's Amazon Web Services. Everyone's heard of AWS. It uses approximately 1,000 milliwatts of energy as well. But that's spread across a large area in Virginia, and it's not all housed under one roof. This base will be 1,968,000 square feet and be 4 stories tall. It will be bordered by water on all sides to help keep it cool. So yeah, that's just a small sampling of some of these giant research centers that are being built.
It's amazing.
There's more and more. Yeah, there's more and more. I mean, tell me, man, have you heard of any other massive ones that I missed that you wanted to talk about?
I mean, the only other one I think, because you were just naming all, were we talking about that one that's in France and it's very similar, the fusion reactor, where all those lasers are pointed to this little thing that you can put in your hand and it's trying to create a star? I think we brought that up when we were talking about nuclear fission creating a star on Earth and whatnot. I think that one's particularly fascinating. But one thing I wanted to bring up here, which is that when you look at it, I think it's not just these research centers, but even cities. I did read an article. It was in Harvard Business Review, and it was like, why today's corporate research centers need to be in cities. Well, why is that? Why are research centers really important, really in general, right? Research centers, whether it's public or private, obviously they're there to help bridge innovation, get people together, get people with like minds going. You see this happening. Pfizer actually has its largest research center in Kendall Square, right down the street from Harvard and Cambridge, blocks away from MIT. Google is housing its machine learning research hub in Pittsburgh, right near Carnegie Mellon. Obviously, all the work that's happening inside Silicon Valley, there's a lot of innovation happening out there. Why? Everyone's sort of co-located. And this makes sense. This goes all the way back to Bell Labs, which I think actually is a very interesting PaleoFutures we can bring up. Of course, Bell Labs is the AT&T's iconic innovation center that was out of Murray Hill, New Jersey, where they parked people. But one of my most fascinating thoughts when it comes to this is Oak Ridge, Tennessee. A lot of people don't remember, during the Manhattan Project, the United States actually created whole cities. Oak Ridge was one, Los Alamos was one as well, where it was a gigantic city full of scientists, full of employees that was secret, that went and created the, whether it was the secretaries going all the way up to the scientists who lived there, the folks that researched and eventually created the nuclear bomb. And just shows you that. And this was just 1940s, and they kept this a secret the entire time until the dropping of the nuclear bombs on Japan. So these ideas of huge, giant, mega research areas are they're not old, or excuse me, they're not new. They're definitely old. I think we can even probably go back to maybe the Library of Alexandria as a place where a lot of people came together to sort of connect information. I think it's vital that we do this. I think and it doesn't matter whether we're chasing neutrinos or we're trying to understand with the beginning of the universe, or we're trying to communicate with extraterrestrial life, or we're just trying to figure out where AI is going to take us. I think it's really important that we all get like minds next to each other and have a chance to chat and have a chance to share ideas so we can go out there and bring the future to life. Okay, so for PaleoFutures, I decided to bring up another futurist, one that actually we've had mentioned on the podcast a lot. The gentleman's name is Alvin Toffler. Alvin Toffler, he was an American writer, a futurist, and businessman who was known for his works discussing modern technologies, including the digital revolution and communication revolution, with his emphasis on how this would affect cultures. And one thing, and we were just talking about this before we recorded this. For whatever reason, Alvin Toffler's name comes up like every time whenever we speak to some of the folks who we interview, right? And I kind of wanted to know that, wondered why, and I think I do know why. In essence, a lot of the folks we speak to, they're between 40s, sometimes going all the way up into their 70s. And this would be, I would say, the typical futurist for their time, when they were just exploring the world, right? So a lot of these folks would have been teenagers, early 20s, or even 30s at this time, or early 30s anyway. And so they were. This was cementing themselves in their mind. And I also think that Toffler was one of those folks with his writing that really discussed what would happen to the culture when these future technologies would come, right? So, he was known as a writer. He was associate editor for Fortune magazine, and his early works were, they're very much steeped in technology and its impact. But it wasn't really until his first book in 1970, Future Shock, became a worldwide bestseller, that he really sort of took off, right? And then, of course, he founded Toffler Associates later, which is a management consulting company. He taught at Cornell, faculty member at the New School for Social Research, business consultant, and he is known for having significant influence on a ton of people, to include, Newt Gingrich, China's Zhai Zhang, and of course the founder of AOL, Steve Case, who actually said that Alvin Toffler allowed him to understand how important the interconnected world was going to be, and of course that led him to pushing forward his ideas to make AOL turn into something. So so what did he say? Alvin Toffler, obviously known for very specific writings. One, of course, is that first one I mentioned, Future Shock. He also wrote Power Shift as well. But I think Future Shock is the one novel that is really most sort of talked about, right? And in essence, what is he's really talking about is he's talking about the post-industrial society, something that we're kind of going through now, right? The information society, going from the agricultural to industrial to super-industrial, and then finally post-industrial society. And this was, sort of a definite shock to the systems. So agrarian, industrial, post-industrial. He also talked a lot in Future Shock about the fear of the future. So, the inability to deal with institutions and how we would sort of balance, these issues. Many of the features of this post-industrial society include things like the design of goods, marketplace changes and how difficult that would be to deal with. Transient jobs, people being nomads and have the ability to sort of work all over the place, was something that he talked about. And really, the people of this post-industrial society, their professions would change and their workplace would change as well. And they may have many different careers during their time. An engineer's knowledge may become outdated and they have to go ahead and change. So you could see how a lot of this stuff is actually very pathetic, where these are some of the same issues that we're going through. We're in the post-industrial age that he's talking about, this very information-heavy age. And, I think he was right on, spot on with a lot of stuff he talked about. He foresaw the development of cloning, the popularity and influence of personal computers, of course, the invention of the internet with the aforementioned Steve Case and his pursuit of AOL because of Toffler, and of course cable television and telecommuting. So he was pretty much right on when it came to a lot of this stuff. Now, of course, he didn't get everything right. I know he actually said and predicted that cities were going to lose significance because you don't necessarily have to go to work into the office. You don't have to go to work in the office. You don't have to go into work into the factory. So he said that they would decline. There wouldn't be a need for the cities. I think what we're finding now is that cities are less a place to work, and I think it's more of a place for communal and to live, where interactions and variety is particularly helpful. And also the fact that not everybody is in this post-industrial society, and I think you see a lot of the great cities that are growing in the world are post-industrial, but all of them are still steeped in industry. Additionally, he thought that we would be having colonies in space and underwater. I think this was a little bit of the kind of futuristic vision that was happening in the 1960s and 70s. And he thought that we would just keep on going into the 1960s prosperity. I think one thing we can take is Alvin Toffler is he's a thinker. He's not an economist though, and so it's tough to kind of figure out the future. And I think it's good to note what he hit, but also what he didn't hit. And then one other thing that is interesting that some people say is, he thought that we were going to be very alienated, right? So the fact that we're constantly changing jobs and we won't be connecting with our families and won't be working with each other in these factory jobs would lead to social alienation. I think perhaps this actually might not be something he got wrong, but this may be something possibly he's getting slowly right, especially in the age of social communication and the inability for us to kind of connect and whatnot beyond the Instagram and Facebook feeds that we push on each other. So Toffler, I think he's definitely a prototype futurist, right? He's definitely thinks big. He stitches a lot of these ideas together in not only a unique way but a novel way, because he takes the typical steep ideas, the social, technological, environmental, economic, and political changes, and sort of mixes it in the soup and says, here's a possibility of what's going to happen. My guess is he had a huge impact on a lot of the futurist stalwarts of our time, as we've been noting. These folks talk about him all the time. And yeah, I think he's definitely somebody you can hang your head on as somebody that definitely helped usher in the new future studies movement that really birthed itself out of the 50s, 60s, and 70s and made it all the way to today.
Yeah, I think one thing that would be interesting to mention is that as much as he was such a great futurist, you have to also look at Heidi Toffler was behind every great man is even greater woman, as I say. So Heidi Toffler was a person that I think needs to be mentioned in this conversation too, because she was the co-author for many of his books that went on to influence so many people. And I think when people were talking about the Tofflers, they would talk about both of them in equal measure. As as Heidi was the one who was doing a lot of the research for this, and while he did go on and teach different things, but like they had like a company together, a consultancy that they both worked in. And if you look at like their history together, it's very intertwined, and I think that's a really cool aspect of Alvin, is that there's somebody who was with him every step of the way, working hand in hand with him, and was also friends with all of those influential people, like you mentioned, Newt Gingrich and the Prime Minister of China in 1985, and all those cool things. I think that's really neat, and that's just one thing I wanted to add.
Yeah, no, I am a fan of Alvin for sure. I think I'm even more of a fan of him now. I in some ways I wish he would have sort of expanded. I think he may have kind of gone maybe too corporate. But again, this was the 70s going into the 80s. We did not have the heavy blogging, like a Neil deGrasse Tyson, Ray Kurzweil, somebody who's always doing videos and updates and whatnot. There are actually some really good documentaries. There's actually a documentary you can get on Future Shock. It's not the greatest documentary that I've ever seen, but it's pretty solid. You can get a good view of who he is and the type of thinker he is. And do feel free to go ahead and see if you can pick up Future Shock and the Third Wave, Power Shift. These are all great books to take a look at, and I think they actually speak to the day that we are in, the time that we're in. Not only was he prophetic, but I think what's missing here, not just in the predictions, but I think he did a really good job of showing how these things could influence us in a both positive and negative ways. I think that's where real futures is made. That's where the real money comes in, is not only what the future is going to be like, but how it's going to impact us. And I think that's that my favorite futurists are the ones that kind of give me that view.
All right, folks, it's time for the segment of the show that we like to call FizBiz.
FizBiz. FizBiz.
It's where we yes. It's where we will give you our own opinions on investing and tell you that they are our opinions, and then you are able to make your own decisions after hearing what we say, because you're adults and you were obviously able to download this podcast, so that means that you have the intelligence to make your own decisions. Good job.
Yeah, well, they can. I'm sure they're going to do very well. They're just going to use what you're going to be saying in FizBiz today very properly. I think they're going to make the right investments. That's our job. We are just stewards of this information. We're not actually telling you to do anything, right? Allegedly.
So on this FizBiz, we're going to talk about investing in something that I think is pretty neat, is space technologies. Now, I know what you are thinking, or our listeners are thinking. Space? I mean, there aren't any opportunities in space. Think again. Besides the obvious SpaceX and its boring company, which we've discussed multiple times on the show, there are other technologies and companies trying to profit from space exploration and the riches that await us in outer space. Recently, it's been making headlines that our next profitable venture might be space mining. No, we aren't crazy here, folks. So Goldman Sachs recently published a 98-page report stating that a single random asteroid could possess as much as $50 billion in valuable and rare resources like platinum. Goldman Sachs analyst Noah Popnak wrote that the financial and technological barriers are low, where probes could cost as little as tens of millions of dollars each. And Caltech has even suggested an asteroid-grabbing spacecraft could cost somewhere around the ballpark of $2.6 billion. So a $50 billion asteroid, $2.6 billion investment, not a bad return. Finnish scientists have actually even suggested launching, this was recent, they suggested launching 50 nano spacecraft to explore over 300 asteroids in a close asteroid belt, which would take only 3 years and could yield all sorts of answers about what treasures exist in them. Still, these numbers just scratch the surface of space mining. NASA has discovered an asteroid, and bear with me on this, called 16 Psyche that is potentially worth $10,000 quadrillion, which, if it was actually mined, would collapse this relatively small Earth economy of $74 trillion.
Wow.
Yeah,
Wow. That is a lot of iPhone 8s.
$10,000 quadrillion.
Yeah.
So they actually are launching a mission, and it's going to be launched in 2022, just to explore what type of things could be in Psyche 16. And they're going to arrive at the asteroid in 2026, so relatively soon in our lifetimes. So my question for you, Chris, is what do you think are the implications for an asteroid that is worth that much, $10,000 quadrillion?
Well, I mean, not only could it be a boon for the economy, right? The more money we have, the better we have of potential growth and whatnot. The idea that there's an exponential nature to doing things like mining or something along those lines. The amount of different jobs that can happen, from lowly secretary and janitor all the way up to the engineers that are doing that. But I think this even says something about the idea, and a lot of futurists have this fantastic idea that we are a interstellar civilization and we're more than just the Earth. So the fact that you be able to mine things, which, by the way, we are running out of resources. We have a finite amount of resources on Earth. So it's important that we probably explore not only the getting resources that, by the way, these are very rich and hard to find rare earth minerals. These rare earth minerals are being used, and these metals are being used in all of our electronic devices. So it's really important to the future of the planet to find other resource bits, and whether that's good for the economy, or whether it's just good for us having resources to propel our planet along this electronic explosion that we've been doing, ever since the 1940s and 50s. I say, let's roll the dice and see where that investment goes. I think I read there is as much as $2.8 billion worth of money coming into space ventures. It's grants money, a lot of VC capitals coming in there, some acquisitions, but, lots of investing. I mean, this is billions of dollars is quite a lot of money.
Yeah. So, I mean, that you brought up the point. So, I mean, all our listeners are going to, at least if they're listening to this segment, they're going to say, well, how do you invest? And is it legal? And that's actually a question that has come up recently, like in the past couple of years. So Congress actually passed something called the Space Act Bill of 2015, which allowed for companies to claim resources that they mine in outer space. So this is mainstream, folks. This is not something out actually in outer space. This is something that people are thinking about and Congress has passed. I mean, so that means that these resources, if harvested by a company, are theirs. So basically, who is trying to mine these resources? Well, there's two specific companies that come to mind. They are called Planetary Resources and Deep Space Industries, or DSI. Both who are attempting to build the technologies necessary to mine the asteroids. DSI's stated goal is to build cities in space, but of course that requires money and the mining of resources in order to create these cities. So therefore, Deep Space Industry has created a craft called Prospector X, which will test the technologies that they're creating for space mining. The stated goal is to eventually tug asteroids to a processing center where they will be mined for their resources, and then, of course, could be turned into these cities that DSI is eventually aiming to build. So there was actually, if you go even back further in the past, there was a 1967 outer space treaty that was signed by all these different countries that got together that were in the space race, that basically stated that no company, government, or individual could own a celestial body. And so that's why they passed the Space Act Bill of 2015, which allows the companies to keep those resources that they mine, but obviously not, stake a claim to Mars or the moon or something like that. The other company that I mentioned was Planetary Resources. Now, this is what you were talking about when you said all this investment that's going into it. So Planetary Resources is backed by key expertise, so a NASA scientist, and includes investors like Google's CEO Larry Page, filmmaker James Cameron, and Sir Richard Branson. They're already working on a spacecraft, and it's called Orchid, that will eventually be launched as a fleet into the solar system to image these asteroids, kind of like what the Finnish scientists were suggesting be done. So they've already launched Acroid, but mining an Acrid, but mining an asteroid might still be a decade away. Investing in space mining might be a risky endeavor too, because these two companies. So investing in it now would be a risky endeavor, as these two companies have to exist long enough to see this fruition, of all this research and money they're pouring into it. And they also have to beat out any potential competitors in the future in order to see that this giant reward, this 10,000 quadrillion dollars for their efforts. So I'm gonna bring it back to you, Chris. So do you think that we'll ever realistically have space mining?
Yes. It's just a matter of when. Right, and is the technology there? Do we have the will to actually invest in these leading edge technologies? I would say in the United States that some of that will may be losing itself, and not because of anything other than our own petty self-interest. Right, we're having too much of an issue knowing how and when to spend our money on domestic stuff, and I don't think we've really thought about what the power of the promise of space meant to the 1960s. That all famous speech, about going to the moon, that was more than just a pie in the sky futuristic vision. That speech actually propelled many engineers, many scientists, and of course all the folks who came along with NASA to put their like minds together to help get a man on the moon. And what happened? An explosion of computing technology, an explosion of computer scientists, an explosion of electrical engineers, mechanical engineers. Lots of brains went into that, and that, I think, helped lead to the fantastic world that we had post that. So, to me, I think we need to start to think bigger in the United States, and we need to be able to feel free to go ahead and use some of our money beyond just war fighting and beyond just trying to placate our enemies abroad, and start thinking about really the power of human imagination and where it will take us. And obviously one of those spots is space, and I think we need to definitely put our worth behind it.
I think that you brought up an interesting concept, because there's actually been a lot of conversation around this. And this is also another risk when you're talking about investing in space mining, because you have to look at the political aspect of it. So there are people out there who think that actually all the resources that should exist in, outside of planet Earth should belong to all of us. And there's a prevailing thought that, I've talked about UBI a lot, that you can fund UBI through space mining. And that you can pay everybody from the resources that exist in the universe, so that people can have a standard of living that is equitable. That's an issue. I don't think that will happen, but that has been discussed. There's all sorts of other political issues that may occur. It's a future idea, and so that's why I wanted to actually bring it back to what about current space investing. Because that's obviously a prospecting issue. If we're looking at current space investing, people will probably look at companies like SpaceX. What most people think that SpaceX is this massively successful company that's being bankrolled by the government, and they must earn a hefty profit with their reusable rockets. And the answer to that is that SpaceX only earned an operating profit of 0.2% on $1 billion in revenue last year, and that it recorded a $260 million loss on $945 million in revenue in 2015. Now, that was in the past, but Spacelook is looking to target $1.8 billion in revenue and achieve a 3% operating profit margin, as opposed to a company like Boeing that still has a 10% margin, or Airbus that has a 5.7% profit that it gets from its space division. Still, I think that SpaceX is kind of like this novel company that is, widely publicized, that's getting a competitive advantage actually in these reusable rockets, which actually significantly makes their launches cheaper. Frankly, I think that SpaceX, if you can find a way to invest in it, obviously, It's a very sound investment that will pay off for early investors because of the buzz around it. And because I believe that when the founder is at the helm of a business, like we've discussed in the past, I think that they tend to have this noted success, and that success is more likely to play out in their business. Um, I would actually, if I could, I think SpaceX is still privately owned. If I remember correctly, you can't really invest in it unless you're a seed funder or things like that. But when it does go public, if it does, and I think it will, I think it would be of sound investment, because I think that Elon Musk has a vision for SpaceX, and it's not necessarily a vision that is this, utilitarian in nature. I think it's, he's looking at profit because he is a very wealthy individual, and he didn't become that way by just giving away all of his money. I think that would be a sound investment. But in the meantime, you could invest in these companies that are also reaping the benefits of this space age that's been going on since the 60s, of Boeing and Airbus that are still getting the contracts from NASA. But I think SpaceX is eventually, the way that it is moving right now, it is going to become cheaper for us to be in space, and that is going to be a significant boon that they're going to have. We'll see if Boeing and Airbus can match that. If they can, I think that takes away SpaceX's advantage. But those are current space investing companies that I would look at. And if you want to get involved in that, then I would take a look at that. I guess my last question, and Chris, you could tell me, is there any other space technologies or companies that you think are worth of these investments?
Well, obviously there's the battle between Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos that is hanging out. I do think that the LEO technology, the actual the low Earth orbits, I think that's a little bit more of a play, a little bit quicker than the mining. The mining's a little more fantastic. I would definitely still pay attention to the regular tech giants, as they're going to be working to give us internet all over the entire world. So, and this does involve satellite technology. Keep in mind, satellite is this is still space that we're talking about. Actually, I would actually look not only just at the investments, but also how we can invest our tax dollars. This is something that we don't talk about when we talk about profit, but we profit off of also the proper investment of our governments. So whether this is a global podcast, we speak in English, but English is a global language. So to everybody overseas, this is going out to you. Pay attention to how your government is looking at exploring space. I know Africa has satellites that they've launched. India and China, Japan, Europe, Russia, all have, and even South America now, are all really using some of the capital that they're pulling together from their citizens to learn how to work in space, what to do with space, how to build the scientific cadre that will lead them into this new venture. We still I think are very early. I think obviously the United States and countries like Russia and the ones I really just mentioned, they have a little bit of a head start. But that doesn't mean that these folks couldn't learn from them, and that doesn't mean that the countries of the world can't take a hard look at, hey, we need to go ahead and invest in space. This is definitely a possibility for us, more than just monetary. This has to do with our planet. This has to do with scientific discovery. I think this has to do also with innovations, and also potential innovations that may actually benefit us here on Earth. When it comes to garbage removal or building any sort of infrastructure there in space and other planets to allow us to propagate the human species. So I think it's important, whether it's public or private investment, is an extremely important thing to pay attention to. Space is it's the future, and it always will be.
Yeah, I think that you brought up a really interesting topic that I'm glad you brought up, and that's satellite launching. That is actually something that SpaceX is betting on will help them generate a lot of profit. because using these reusable rockets, they're going to launch. They have this plan to launch this all these different satellites to bring the internet to the world, like you said, and to have that kind of encapsulate the United States, or the Earth, so that all these people can be using these satellites. There's a company out there that's actually using planes that can enter into low Earth orbit and like tow a satellite into space and to put it into low Earth orbit. There's really cool things like that are space technologies, and we're talking about just around our own Earth, that I think that are going to generate these hefty profits again for these companies as well. So take a look at that as well. I mean, you were mentioning space tourism. So I think, look at Virgin, is betting on that. They're betting that people will pay hundreds of thousands of dollars to take a ride and, experience weightlessness for, 5 minutes or 2 minutes or something like that. So we'll see. I think you're right that I think in the future, commerce is going to be the driver of space as opposed to the government. And I'm really interested to see what's going to happen in the next 15, 20 years, where all of these new technologies are going to allow us to explore space more and more. And, it's up for our listeners to decide if they're worth investing in.
Let's do it, man. I can't wait to record the show in 30, 40 years, and we can do it and see the Milky Way all the way up there. Okay, great. So for the interview segment for Some Futures today, we have Joe Tankersley. Joe is a writer, a futurist, and former Walt Disney Imagineer, and he believes in harnessing the power of narrative to create better tomorrows. He explores the intersection of narrative and foresight, which are designed to help others imagine and express their own visions for better tomorrows. And his work ranges from one-on-one consultation with changemakers to orchestrating glimpses into the future for mass audiences. So, wow, that's super exciting, Joe. I got one question that I have just right out the bat. We've spoken to many futurists about storytelling. What they look into in terms of science fiction, imagining futures and whatnot. And again, thank you for joining the podcast. This is another really cool thing. I need to say that. But why is storytelling so important to future studies?
Well, thanks for having me on, guys. For me, I think it's the essential bridge between the research and deep thinking that futurists do and being able to communicate that to people who don't live in the future like we do. The future is nebulous for most people. It tends to be somewhat obscure. And I think we really struggle to try to get these ideas across. And of course, story is the best way to do that. People understand narrative. Particularly narratives that they can find some piece of normalcy in, something that relates to them and they see themselves. And I think that's the real value more than anything else.
Yeah, well, that's fantastic. It's one thing we look at too. The futurists we speak to, they are talking about narrative. They're talking about the importance of creating and crafting a story so people completely understand things. But are there any types of stories that you think resonate better than others? Is there certain types of stories or certain types, whether it's a video, whether it's a play, any sort of things? I know you're an Imagineer, so I'm sure you have some examples of things you've used, but when it comes to exploring the future, are there certain types of stories that audiences really latch onto?
Well, now you've invited me to get on my soapbox, so that could have been a mistake on your part, but
soapbox away.
So rather than talk about different medium, I'll talk about that in a second. The first piece for me is the type of story that you tell. Jay Ogilvy, who was one of the founders of Global Business Network, and had a huge impact on my work early on from a book he had written. And he made the observation that negative scenarios are really easy to create, but it's really hard to do anything with them. On the other hand, positive scenarios are really difficult to create to keep them from becoming just, fantasy. But they're the only ones that create real change. And so that's always kind of been the basic motto in the work that I do. I think that useful future stories need to be positive, at least in terms of showing people that tomorrow can be better. Because if you look at social marketing change, what they learned 50 years ago was that people don't change their behavior because it's better for them. They change their behavior because they find something inspiring about what the future might look like. And I think futures have to do that as well. The second piece for me, and this is a real, sticks with me with a lot of the work that I see out there, too many futurists get too excited about shiny technology. And we tell these stories as if technology was the future. It's not. People are the future. Characters are what are important. And I think the best future stories are the one that provide a little bit of messiness. Future's not going to be perfect. We get that. But also focus on the fact that they're real people doing real things, trying to make their life better. That, to me, is an incredibly important part of that. It's interesting. I was when I was at Disney, I was part of a group of corporate futurists who would get together from time to time. And we were having a workshop, and they brought in, I think it was the Moth Storytelling Group, a group that's really famous for doing storytelling and teaching it. And they were going on and on about how great story was. And there was a woman there who worked for a large corporation as a futurist. And she stood up finally and she said, I just spent thousands of dollars on this video that was supposed to be a day in the life in the future. And I showed it at my conference, and I watched the people in the audience just turn off. Because quite frankly, it was incredibly boring. Nobody cares how you brush your teeth in 2035. That's not an issue. And so I think we have to get away from that and understand that when we say story, we need something with conflict and narrative. That was a long answer and not really to your question. The answer to your question about what medium works best is an interesting one. The more immersive, the more hands-on, the more dynamic medium is always better. But we don't get to use it as often as we'd like to because we're typically restricted in budgets. And that's why I think so many futurists fall back to written stories. But certainly video, film, immersive theater, experience. So when I was at Disney, we did a lot of stuff with games and experience. Those are increasingly more effective in terms of engaging people.
Well, and I guess to build off of that, I know that you've said that you have this idea of the future being boring. So when you talk about mediums, can you tell me where does like science fiction, fantasy, film fit into the role of futurist studies and storytelling?
It's a great question, and it's really interesting. I mean, I know you both have seen this. There's a ton of stuff being written lately. Suddenly, science fiction has become the cool new thing for futurists. And in fact, there are a number of companies out there promoting that. They're futurists who use science fiction. I'm of a slightly different point of view. I love science fiction, but I think really powerful futures narrative needs to be closer to what I call science factual, which is an old Disney term. Science fiction to me has a couple of challenges. One of them is the best science fiction, the world's going, to crap. That's what makes great science fiction, because you need that level of conflict. It's interesting. I just finished, Cory Doctorow's Walk Away. Brilliant book. Cory's a great futurist as well as a great science fiction writer. But the promotion for the book talked about it being a utopian future. And I don't know if you've read the book or not, but while it talks about what it would be like to live in a world of abundance, what it really is about is how hard it would be for the status quo to accept that abundance. I don't read the book and come away thinking, wow, I want to go out and embrace that future. I come away going, that would be really difficult. And I think that's the real distinction between what I call real science fiction from science fiction writers and what I think we need to do, which is, not quite as sexy sometimes. And that's hard to accept.
Well, and so why should we tell these stories about the future? What does it exactly enable us to do? I mean, obviously you're from your own experience in Disney, and I've read some of your short stories that you've sent us. Like, why is it important that we tell these stories?
Well, I think there are two big uses in terms of how I use them with clients specifically. The stories are all based on the research and the data, and we've done the deep dive, and we've talked about the different scenarios, and we've imagined what might be possible. When I want a client to really begin to think about what their strategy might be, I find that if I give them a story set in the scenario we're working with, or many multiple scenarios, it is so much easier for them to react to it. They can go, no, wait, I don't want to do that. Or wait, that sounds really interesting. Or most importantly, wow, we're way away from being able to accomplish that future. So I think it's much easier for them to do that. The second piece is when I leave a client engagement, one of the things I hope to leave them with is some of these stories, which they can then use to create conversations. One of the things that the big challenge, as both of you know, with futures is we're never trying to lock in on a single vision of the future. So part of the value of the story is it's a little bit provocative, and people can start to attack it and say, no, that's not going to be the future. It's not going to happen like that. And that makes it easier, I think, for people who don't work in this world every day to really, really think deeper about what might be possibility and what different scenarios might be.
So there's a lot of different things happening in terms of new technology and new mediums for which humanity is starting to interact with, right? So the power of virtual reality is now soon being harnessed. And augmented reality is not only a fantastic possible future, but it's a reality right now. I was just seeing the Art Kit with Apple, and Google has some APIs that's allowing for augmented reality to be a part of our own reality right now. So we're really just starting to see going beyond infancy, and we're starting to walk a little bit into these worlds. How do you think these new technology mediums are going to affect how futurists like yourself are going to start to craft stories in the future?
Well, I think virtual reality is going to be a huge game changer, particularly as it becomes more accessible to create those experiences. As we sort of talked about, the real challenge with thinking about the future is how do you get other people to visualize it and experience it? And I know both of you are probably familiar with some of the studies that have been done on virtual reality. Huge empathy builder if you put people in a virtual reality situation, right? Huge ability for them to really imagine in a way that they never could before. So I'm really excited about seeing how we can start to get our hands on those tools and really use them. And I think there's some people out there doing it. Right now, it still feels like it's a little bit of a budget issue for most projects. But I think that'll change in the next few years. Augmented reality may be the more useful tool because it seems like it's more adaptable and you can use it in different places. And I think there's some really fascinating ideas of, I can see the future with these things. And if I can see it, then it's so much easier for me to go, yes, I want it, or no, I don't want it, that kind of thing.
I'm wondering if you could unpack that a little bit, though, right? I mean, you're saying that it's fascinating, but what, as a storyteller, I mean, you've done this sort of stuff before. So, what is it about these new mediums, or even other things? So, we had on our second podcast, we had a futurist. His name was Trevor Haldenby, and Trevor's he graduated from OCAD, and so he actually links designs and futures together, and he creates, even beyond just virtual reality or augmented reality, he creates experiential futures where you actually can walk inside futures. And I know, of course, Disney is known for that, putting you right there and having people explore futures by actually stepping inside of it, which I think is super fascinating. So, maybe tell us a little bit about, what is really your take on the future of storytelling, and why you think it might be helpful, or even particularly transformative for the human experience.
Well, let me start to try and answer that question by talking about the past, maybe. Walt Disney opened the first theme park in 1955, and what he said his goal was he wanted to put people inside his movies, not tell them stories, but actually immerse them in the stories he had already created. That was his real goal. Of course, the technology at the time, the best they could do was an audio animatronic character who could kind of move around a little bit. But that's been, I think, the trend in terms of the goal of storytellers, maybe since the beginning of time, which is not just so much to communicate a story to you, but to put you in it in any way that we possibly can. And virtual reality gets us closer than anything we've ever gotten to, short of, mind melding, which will come next, but we'll have to wait a few years for that. But the idea for a storyteller in virtual reality is I don't have to, it breaks down so many of the barriers. I tell you a story, and in your mind's eye, you're going to see it the way you imagine it. I put you in a virtual reality experience, and I know you're seeing what I imagine. Now, how you react to it becomes different. And one of the really interesting things, if you talk about the future of storytelling, and this has been a long debate with a lot of people I've worked with, it changes the relationship between the author or creator and the audience. It really becomes less of an authority to a consumer and more of a peer-to-peer, like pretty much everything else in the world today. And so it's an interesting challenge for people who think of themselves as storytellers to think about, how do I become a partner with the person who's going to consume or experience my story? And the other piece of it is, story is no longer something that happens in a set period of time. That's the other sort of interesting piece about virtual reality. A written story, even a film story, has a beginning, a middle, and an end, and we kind of know what it is. As you start to think about story living all the time, living everywhere, that's a really exciting time. I don't know exactly where it goes. I think it's real challenging from a creator's point of view.
Well, and to build on that, so Disney recently put out it was a story that was released recently that said that Disney's going to start using artificial intelligence to craft new stories and determine what makes a great story. Are you surprised about that? Or, I know Disney is actually, people don't realize that they're actually pretty heavily into tech. You have the Disney Underground and everything like that. So, tell me about what you think about artificial intelligence being involved in storytelling.
Well, like everyone else in the world, there are moments when I wake up and go, oh my goodness, some robot or piece of software is going to take my job from me in the future. It's interesting to try to imagine, part of it is I think it makes us understand that the concept of creativity is not necessarily as elusive and magical as we would like to believe it is. The truth is, most people who create anything do it by working really hard, following some rules, and occasionally breaking them. We may have to compete with artificial intelligence in the future. That's okay, I guess. I think the other piece, what I'm really interested in, is how artificial intelligence will work as a collaborator. And I think there's some real potential there that I haven't really seen anybody define yet, but I think that's something that's really interesting. If I have any huge fear, what really concerns me the most is that anything that's data-driven, to me, and some other people may see this differently, but anything that's data-driven is really about replicating the past. All the data in the world tells you what people did last night or yesterday or last year. And so you then predict what they're going to want to do next week, right, because of that. And for many things, that's useful. I'm not sure. I think it's going to take a long time before AI really reaches the point where it can be truly innovative and think of the thing that's never been done before. I think that's the one saving grace we have as frail humans in this future.
Well, is that we can be empathetic as well as opposed to an artificial intelligence that may not have, what it means to be human is involved in storytelling. Correct?
We can only hope.
Well, and okay, so I want to jump to something different here for a second, because I know that you had we originally started talking. You had mentioned that you think that you originally described yourself as a generalist when it comes to future studies. Can you tell me and now why have you decided to focus in this specific area, and should futurists in the future also be focusing more and more on specific areas? We've talked to some people who are transhumanists and generalists and stuff like that. Tell me why you decided to focus on storytelling and why futurists should do that, should focus on one area.
Well, I think it's a challenge for most futurists, because I think most people who have the mindset for this kind of work tend to be, we may all be a little ADD, that may be part of it, but we tend to be interested in a broad range of things, because until you start to think holistically, it's really hard to sort of understand what might happen. The honest answer to your question is it's a marketing and business decision for most of us. If it's a lot harder to convince a potential client that you can deal with their future of whatever if you haven't done that 10 times in the past. They don't always make that jump. As someone said, when a client goes out and looks for a consultant, What they're really looking for is a person that's already done the job that they're actually trying to hire them to do. I don't think that's necessarily good, but I think it's an economic reality. So I think part of it really is driven by that decision. For me, the story piece transcends all topics. It's really more about, do you want to dig deeper into a particular subject? And there are a couple of advantages to doing that. One of them is just, in the world we live in today, is sort of sanity on the part of the futurist. Because if I try to keep up with too many things, I spend all of my time doing research. And it's easier to focus on just a few things and to go much deeper in them. Although I will say, as I ramble on here, that I think the advantage of a futurist is to not be an expert in a field. Because the minute you're an expert in the field, you believe all the authorities in the field. And I think that's what we have to be very careful about.
Or you end up believing yourself as opposed to, what everyone else is saying. You think you're 100% right. Yeah, I can totally agree with that and see that. I also wanted to ask you. I know that you had mentioned that you are currently writing a book, right? It's and you're calling it the Digital Renaissance. Can you explain kind of what you're trying to do with this book? And without giving anything away, obviously, we want people to buy it. But tell us a little bit about what you're doing with that.
Well, it's been an interesting project. It has morphed over time. It started out really thinking about really talking about the practice of how to use story for futures. And it didn't take me long to realize that not only was I not that interested in writing about that, but I was pretty sure no one else was interested but me. And so what I ultimately came to was it's an example of the practice. So it's based on the idea of what I call scenario vignettes. I ultimately created a handful of those that are a way to illustrate a larger scenario. And this larger scenario is what I call the digital renaissance. And what I'm really trying to do is capture what that future might look like from a number of different viewpoints. A lot of it is about work and life. That's because I think those are the most interesting futures for most people. What does economics look like in this future seen through the lens of an individual, whether they're an entrepreneur, whether they, are a citizen, whether they run a business, whatever. And so that's a very vague sort of explanation of what the book is. But what I'm really excited about is the idea that and the interesting thing for me was I did the trend research. I started creating the vignettes, and out of the vignettes came the scenario. It wasn't a top-down thing. It was a bottom-up piece. And as I kept looking at them, I kept going, wow, this is really interesting. There's a thread here that really ties these very disparate, urban, rural, suburban members of different age groups, say 20 years into the future, together. And as I started to think about that, I began to realize I was creating this digital renaissance idea. So that's the idea behind the book. I hope it will be finished very, very soon. Of course, I've been hoping that now for a couple of months, but I'm still plugging away.
So this thread that you're kind of talking on, right? One thing that you see, and we were kind of talking about, right, the differences in dystopian versus utopian futures and how to sort of attack those. I'm just wondering if you, maybe to go back to the question then about what makes good futures and what makes good future storytelling. Is there any sort of scenarios or threads or frameworks that you think that futurists kind of always latch onto? And I don't want to go straight back to the dystopian. I mean, and you talked a little bit about in terms of technology, but the human aspect is so important. I think it's an important part. It helps us deal with the black swan events that happen, whether it be a 9/11 or the beginning of the internet, right? And to me, my favorite types of futures are where it's actually a human dealing with it, right? So it's like when I look at work like Brazil, right? The Terry Gilliam movie, and that the concept of the future government being this haphazard bureaucracy, or even look at something like Her, the Spike Jonze science fiction movie that came out 5-6 years ago, where how we interact with our technology and how it changes us as people. So do futurists figure out that human aspect as best as they can, and are there ways to actually paint the human aspect of future storytelling that are particularly compelling for folks to use when they go and try to create scenarios?
So let me answer that question in an incredibly roundabout way. When I first became interested in futures and foresight was probably the late 90s. I was working at Disney at the time, and I went to my first World Future Society meeting. And I listened to, at the time, pretty much the last generation of futurists doing all their presentations. And I came away so incredibly disappointed because I had this. I was expecting to be so excited about the future, and I was just almost numb. It was nothing but data. It was nothing but this sort of recitation of either positive or negative futures. And it was at that moment that I said, well, this is why the futures field needs me, because I'm a storyteller, and I really understand what it means to tell a story. And I don't think that's not a skill that futurists necessarily have. Most of them don't come from that point of view. A lot of the theory that I've seen that's been written on using story for futurists, at the risk of sounding incredibly arrogant, feels to me like social scientists trying to be creative. And so I think one of the things is that in general, futurists don't do a good job of telling the human angle and the human aspect of the story. It's the only thing that in the end of the day that really matters to people. It's interesting. What's the new? It's Stanley Kim Robinson's new book, 2140, which is a really interesting science fiction book set in New York, 100 years into the future, but it could be next week, except for the fact that all the buildings are flooded. And he really talks about the financial institutions from the point of view of human interaction with it. So I don't know if that's an answer to your question, but except to totally agree with you, right? You have to start with what's a compelling, interesting story about people struggling, because that's where the drama is. And I think I see that so rarely in so many of the future stories. Everything's wonderful, shiny, and happy, or terrible, or we're just all dying because the world's come to an end. And you have to give them a glimpse of how they can be that person. I mean, that's why story works, right? You see the story and you see, oh, I could be that hero. And it's a lot harder to be the hero in Captain America than it is to be a hero in a good scenario vignette for the future. So I think that's the key. I mean, if that's an answer or not, I'm not sure to your question.
No, I mean, I think that's good. To us anyway, when we look at PaleoFutures each week on our podcast, those are the stories that resonate with us, is the actual human element. So I'm glad that you're giving a voice to that. And I think it's really important to share not only with our audience, but I think with would-be futurists when they go out there and try to attempt to craft those scenarios. And it's not just about the data, right? It's about, okay, how are we going to function as human beings sort of inside that data? So I think that's a very accurate statement. It's good to hear from somebody who's been in the business for so long like you. I wanted to ask you a little bit about creativity though as well. I think it's one thing for you. You've worked in the creativity industry for so long. I myself, I think I'm creative, but I actually haven't done it. This is about as creative as Jack and I are getting in terms of getting folks on the call and and crafting together our blog and updating folks on our Facebook page. But I myself, I could barely draw. I could sing okay, but like sometimes when I think of creativity, I'm like, oh man, I just don't have it in me. Is there something that you can give to our audience and maybe would be futurists about the problem of attacking creativity and how to go about, really letting loose all the creative bugs that are inside your own mind?
Well, I don't know how to make you a better drawer. It's certainly something I can't do either. So, well, one of the things, and this comes from the years at Disney, and it was probably the best lesson learned there. And you guys may have heard some of these stories, but the motto at Walt Disney Imagineering was always anything is possible. And when you start trying to craft a story, solve a problem, create something new, you begin by you take all of the reasons why you can't do it and you set them aside. And we call that blue sky thinking. But for most creative people, the biggest problem is their own self-censoring, their own, oh, that's impossible, or nobody wants to hear that, or that's a ridiculous idea. And so you really have to stretch beyond that and really quit worrying about how you do it in the beginning. Think about what it is you want to accomplish. I used to work, because at Disney we would take stories and turn them into physical experiences. We had to work with all sorts of engineers and architects and things like that. And I had a great engineer I worked with a lot. And I came in one day and I pitched this idea that we'd been working on. And I was all excited and telling him this great story and everything like that, and how we were going to do this wonderful experience. And he looked at me, dead straight, and he said, "That's a great idea, but it violates all the laws of physics." To which my response was, "Well, is that a misdemeanor or a felony, right? What are we talking about here?" And then next week he came back and said, "Well, okay, this is how we can make it happen." And I think that's the most important attitude for any creative experiences. Let's not worry about why it won't work. Let's worry about what we want to do, and then we'll figure out how to make it happen.
Okay, and so I had a question, and this is kind of pertaining. I'm going to do a little bit of deep thought here. Is so I actually teach a course on strategic foresight for a group of Masters of Business Administration students, and one thing that I have them do is actually give to write a story about the future. So if you were put in that scenario, what kind of story would you want to write? I know, right? It's deep thought there.
Well, I mean, my sort of pat answer to that is to look back at what I've been doing with the book, which is really a series of stories about different people engaging in the future. One of the things I'm most interesting about is I want the reader, when they read the story, to say, "Oh, okay, that future doesn't seem so scary to me right now." I think that's a huge issue in this country today. People feel so overwhelmed that the idea of AI, the idea of robots, and all of this other technology seems too scary. And they feel like they're not going to be who they are anymore. So I think that's one of the main elements that I'm always interested in. In terms of topics, I unfortunately like just about everything. Right now, for instance, I'm really interested in, what's the future? What's the intersection between the ending of physical retail spaces, shopping malls, and new forms of communities? I think there's an interesting story there. Cory Doctorow told it many years ago, though, when he had people take over the Magic Kingdom after it had been abandoned. But I think that's an interesting way to talk about that shift, right? Here's an economic shift that's happening, and we typically look at it and go, "Oh my goodness, suburbia is going to die." It's not. It's going to become something different. So what does that different look like? And if you think about that from an individual point of view, where's the opportunity? And then that's kind of the story that's on my mind today, at least.
You're saying the story of the disruptive change in society is the stories that you're particularly compelled of? Is that what you're saying?
Well, yeah. I mean, for me particularly, there are two things. One is, at the moment, and I think this will be consistent for most of my future work, I am convinced that we are underestimating the size of the current disruption. We're like fish. We're living in it, and so we don't know that it's water. But what's really going on with the digital revolution is a huge change across the board. And I think that disruption is creating a real sense of unease. In fact, Alvin Toffler was right 50 years ago. We really are suffering from future shock. So the stories that interest me are the ones that help us navigate that disruption. And in fact, maybe because I'm a naive optimist, I actually believe what's on the other side is really exciting, because what I see in the big, consistent sort of thread throughout all of this digital change that's going on is a huge amount of empowerment for individuals and small groups. I mean, it's just incredible when you stop and think about what a person can do today, in terms of what it used to take hundreds of people or an entire corporation to do. That's the story I want to tell to people, is how do you start to get thinking, open up that door and get folks to go, well, wait a minute, I can go out and I can be a broadcaster. I can start a podcast, two guys and a little bit of equipment, and, there you go. And, I started out in film and television a long, long time ago, and it took $2 million worth of equipment just to even try to do anything. So that kind of empowerment shift is the story that's really most interesting to me.
Yeah, and what do you know? Two, like you said, two guys just jumping on and getting able to talk to a futurist about the future of storytelling. That's about as meta as you can get, right? But no, well, so I want to think a little bit fantastically right now for my last question here. Artificial intelligence currently is taking over a lot of things, right? We just put on our Facebook page, artificial intelligence just wrote and created their own pop album, right? So goes in some Google algorithm and out pops a pop album. We're starting to see artificial intelligence and machine learning recreate Rembrandts from scratch. We're starting to see artificial intelligence agents dreaming whole worlds and showing what those worlds look like and whatnot. What I want to know from you is what happens when humans don't write the stories? What what then, and then also, is there a way that we can use artificial intelligence or some of these new type of technologies to augment the stories into multiple types of directions? We were just kind of talking about what I think of when I think of the future of storytelling, and I imagine it with my AR and or VR goggles on. I'm thinking of a Game of Thrones episode where I get to actually see the dragon flying right next to me, or I get to explore not only just the episode of Game of Thrones or Westworld or whatever, but I get to actually go and step inside of it and then go even deeper into this universe. You see this already happening when it comes to the multiplayer online video games, like World of Warcraft, where you get to explore and be a whole new person, and there's a whole new lifestyle, sort of like Second Life as well. So, what is the future of storytelling when humans not only aren't making it, but also when that they're getting augmented by, an intelligence that's allowing for this hugely rich story landscape that we couldn't even, imagine just a couple of years ago.
Well, I'm really glad you decided to end things on a really easy question. Appreciate that. A couple of things to try and cover all of that. One of the things that most people don't realize is you've been dealing with AI for years now in video games. That's really how video games work, particularly the more elaborate ones. Things are created and by following the algorithms that say, if you do this, here are the different things. Well, that's basically all AI is really at some level. As it becomes more advanced, I think there are two or three different directions things might go. One of the interesting things about all the conversation about AI replacing human beings is that we look at creativity as being a business, and it is right now. That's how we look at it. But imagine for a moment that things shift radically and we figure out that machines and robots and AI can do all of the basic work that needs to be done. And we do adopt universal basic income, an idea that is starting to have some reasonable discussion around it. What happens then? Well, what happens then is you free up all of the humans to be creative and in ways without the pressure to be in business. So I think in some ways, if you turn over the business part of creativity, let the AI create the pop songs, but you can go write the song you've always wanted to write. And there may only be 5 people who want to hear it, but that's okay because you're engaged in that activity. So at one level, we may be seeing this huge, huge shift in terms of what it means to be creative and creativity being a business versus being a life form. 100 years ago, you didn't go to a concert. You got together with your friends in the backyard and everybody knew how to play an instrument. That may be that we unburden ourselves and go back to that kind of world. That's one possibility, I think. The other thread, the other potential scenario is if you really look at artists today, it is that what they're selling is an image. Celebrity has become a huge piece of being an artist. AI is going to have a hard time, I suspect, for a long time competing with celebrity. I don't care how sexy you make a piece of software, it's still a piece of software. It's still not going to do things like have inappropriate pictures show up on Twitter, right? It's not going to get in a flame war with the other celebrities. So celebrity is going to always be around. And that's a big part of the business of creativity. So I think there are lots of interesting different ways that this will play out. I don't have answers. I think it's one of those big imponderables that we're really looking at. But I think the other final piece that I would throw out there that I think isn't part of the puzzle is in 20 years, probably sooner, the idea of what is real and what is virtual will become almost indistinguishable. And it just won't matter anymore. Because the truth is, anybody who's spent any time studying philosophy that's difficult to understand understands that all of this is a construct. And all we're doing is creating better constructs. So I think a lot of these questions will just kind of become no big deal. If you played Second Life, you engaged with, beings that were bots. You didn't care as long as you had a good experience. Hopefully that was an equally vague answer to an incredibly difficult question.
No, that's what this is about, right? Exploring and going as deep as we can and trying to understand that. But, speaking of writing a song you want to write, I just wanted to see if you want to tell the audience, what is some work? I know you're currently working on this digital Renaissance piece, but is there anything else you'd like to plug? Any talks or any new papers or any new work that you've got that you want to kind of give some voice to?
Well, a couple of the areas that I'm working in beyond the sort of focus on the digital Renaissance piece, interestingly enough, one of them is the future of aging, which is relevant because I'm going to age soon. But I think it's a really interesting field that I don't see enough work in. If you talk to people in that world, they realize they're the next disruption. The old system's not going to work when 75 million baby boomers get old. And so I think that's a really great field for futurists to be looking at right now because there are so many opportunities. Also doing some work in how the digital disruption is going to impact the healthcare industry. And that's a fascinating one. If you have spent much time looking at it, you can find hundreds of articles out there about how everything's going to be so cool when we have telemedicine and wearable computers and all of the other really neat, shiny, bright objects. But what there are very few people talking about is how do we get there? How do we change a system that is one of the most highly regulated, dense, hierarchical systems that exist into something that works in the future? And so I'm actually working with a partner who has done a lot of work in healthcare leadership as we start to explore what that might mean. So those are some of the most interesting things that I'm working on right now.
Well, that's fantastic. And, I think maybe we can get you, in a couple months down the road, where we can talk a little bit about the future of aging. I think that'd be a wonderful conversation.
Yeah, it's really, for me, it's really fascinating because it's the interesting thing is how do you get all of these baby boomers to actually engage in that conversation because they're the ones who need to create the future of aging. And I think that's an audience that as futurists, we don't talk about very much. We typically think of whoever's running the corporation.
Well, thanks so much, Joe. I really appreciate you taking your time. It was really, really important, I think, to understand about the future of storytelling. So we can't thank you enough.
Well, thank you, guys. I've certainly enjoyed the conversation. I hope I've shed some light on some topics and hopefully confuse some others. So,
well, thanks, man. Really appreciate it.